Financial Planner, Flow on YouTube.
Light.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
Hey, thanks for being here. Let's get into Charlottesville. And we know the corporate media for the last couple of weeks, they've been making a really big deal, and they've been making a very big push to take down certain statues, to ban the Confederate flag. And, they're continually pushing this agenda that we shouldn't see any of this. We should hide this part of history because it's damaging to the public. I wanted to get your take on why you think they're making this huge push to get rid of these statues and to hide everything that happened during this period.
Well, it's funny. When you look at what they're doing, it's propaganda 101, brainwashing. I mean, you go back into Ed Bernays, basically his techniques into manipulating the masses. I mean, when we look at it, we've got racist Democrats, Antifa, socialists, National Socialists, all of whom clearly haven't read a history book any deeper than the overview. And something's clearly not adding up, though. I mean, if you think about everything in the grand scheme of things, how it unfolded, what happened, it's all a little too convenient for me. I mean, you take Kessler, for instance. He organized the supposed Unite to Right rally, but he was an Obama supporter and an Occupy Wall Street activist. And then out of nowhere, he says he changed his ideologies supposedly back in 2013. And I suppose that's probably just for the buffer. So he jumps from one extreme to the other. That's not exactly a common thing. So either he's dumb as rocks, which, what does that say about his followers, or something else altogether. And that something else this time, I think, is some a little bit sinister. What unfolded was a media opportunity to enrage people who basically oppose Obama's and Clinton's nemesis. Then, instead of picking sides like Obama did during Ferguson and inviting domestic terror threats to the White House for a sit-down, Trump calls everyone out equally. Suddenly, equality is not exactly wanted because evidently Trump, saying that they're all bad wasn't good enough. A bunch of people are crying and beating up others because they want their so-called opponent to be considered more evil than they are, which is weird when you think about it because the people being blamed for being racists and fascists are literally neither and weren't even involved. So it's a distraction. It's a tool of division. I think there are enough people who are figuring out the truth in a lot of different elements, corruption, economics, globalism, etc. And these people from all walks of life are figuring it out. And I think it's scaring someone in power. You look at all the videos and articles of educated Black, white, and red Americans coming out and saying that the people have been lied to and that they support a conservative president that both Republicans and Democrats seem to despise. And then shortly after, this country goes nuts over things that literally affect us none. So you were talking about the statues. Why are we taking down the statues? Why this push towards something that happened, a very long time ago? The push to take down the statues is fairly simple, in my opinion. I don't think it has anything to do with race. In fact, if you know the history of slavery and so on, and that's the excuse. Slavery, it was about slavery, it was about owning people, and they repeat it to nauseam, which is false. These statues, well, it doesn't matter if it's Revolutionary War or Civil War at this point because they all seem to be targets. What they represent is rebellion against an established power. It's a reminder that people stood up against government. And that includes the Revolutionary War. I mean, people talk about, the Confederate flag and these statues, those are symbols of treason. Well, so is the American flag. If you really want to be honest about it, that's exactly what that is. And it's my guess that an established power doesn't want people reminded of this. So they've literally turned all the focus on these statues and people, historical figures, and the masses, for whatever reason, are going along with it and engaging in these debates. And just to be clear, just about every statue of someone who rebelled in some way was targeted, either vocally or physically. I mean, from Thomas Jefferson, Abe Lincoln, not just Confederate war monuments. African American historical monuments have been targeted as well. Monuments of peace. I mean, it's out of control. And I don't know. I mean, when we think about that, we think about the era. We think about what was going on, the complexities of what was going on. It's not as simple as a tweet or a picture or a monument. I mean, it's so much more than that. Now, I don't know. Not all of the statues and monuments have been attacked. They've been threatened. The sad thing is, though, is that the cities that a lot of these places have been targeted, I guess, comply with the demands of these absolutely insane domestic terrorists and voluntarily take them down or remove them. And that's not a blanket statement. Obviously, some of them are standing, strong, I guess, next to them and allowing the citizens to protect them or whatever, But as far as I'm concerned, that's negotiating with terrorists. It reminds me of a study they did about social norms and how people want to follow what they think is popular. The only problem here is that what seems to be popular is utter ignorance, and we're seeing it from all sides. And too many are debating irrelevant elements of the entire situation. Then there's the calls to suggest that monuments and historical is like what you were talking about, that these things belong in books and museums because of how offensive they are to a bunch of people who were not even involved in the events in the first place. But clearly, that way is already proven not to work, considering these people are seemingly offended by something that's not really offensive in the first place, which would become evident if they were actually taught something, read something, or actually visited a museum. No doubt, there are going to be plenty who take issue with that statement. But let me be clear. You cannot talk about the Civil War or anything revolving around the Civil War without talking about South Carolina. And the problem with that is that if you look at it that way, then we know that slavery was nothing more than the straw that broke the camel's back. It was not the cause. And even if it was, nobody seems to be angry about the thousands of black or red slave owners or the thousands of white slaves that preceded the slaves of color. And it wouldn't make any sense to tear down statues of people who literally got rid of their slaves years before the war ever started and decided to help educate and free slaves instead. But that's what they're doing. They're attacking, I guess ultimately what they're doing is demonstrating publicly their ignorance. And it only proves the point that nobody's learning anything. As far as I'm concerned, and as far as the law is concerned, these people are defacing veteran memorials. And the sad part is that the people are not being given a chance to vote on whether or not they should stay or go. It's just taking the law into your own hands and, doing whatever it is you want to do. And I have a strong feeling that these, and I call them domestic terrorists, are just really loud. They're not many, because if it were to go up for a vote, they'd realize how small they were. And of course, if these people were learning anything, they'd discover that South Carolina had been dealing with tariff issues for decades leading up to the war, calling them things like the tariff of abominations and unconstitutional, and null and void. And then, of course, when they had enough, I guess ultimately you had a president that promised to push his will basically on the states, and then they were like, no, I've had enough of that, which again is another example of rebellion. The 10th Amendment, the Bill of Rights, and nobody wants to talk about that. Now, I'm not saying that slavery was right or justified or whatever. I'm just saying that it's definitely not what people are being told. And I think that's what's ultimately allowing this ignorance to continue.
Do you think ultimately the powers that be, are they trying to push like a civil war? Are they trying to split the people up?
Oh, divide and conquer for sure. Absolutely. Now, whether or not they're pushing a civil war, that's hard to say. Now, that's not to say that a civil war couldn't ignite out of this. I think that in a lot of ways, what's happening is a little bit out of everybody's control at this point. short of the fact that media continues to push and push and push, and the power structure still, and I should call them the establishment, definitely wants the people divided. As long as we're all divided, we are not going to unite against that common foe, which is directly affecting not only our current life, but our future life as well. So that's something I think we should all really kind of take into consideration, is that we should probably take a few extra strides to try and unite with those that are supposedly different than us. Because I do think that a civil war is very possible. In fact, Jim Baker, he warned that Christians are going to begin a second civil war if President Trump is ever impeached. These Antifa types are sure trying to spark something up. The media seems to be fueling it. I know it'd be great for their ratings. It seems the establishment would sure like that. So yeah, I think it's possible. My guess, though, is that I guess ultimately the odds are good, but chances are that if it does start, especially over all this racial stuff, it's either going to start between the radical factions first, or because innocent people got in the way and everybody else just got sick of it. If innocent people start getting, start becoming targets, and it seems like that's becoming the case. It's more and more these innocent people are coming out being like, oh, I was attacked or whatever. I think at some point people are just going to get sick of it, and they're going to stop it. The irony, I guess, is that I have this model that I've been working on since about 1999, and I don't know if I've mentioned that before in our previous interviews, but this model actually shows that one of the hot zones moving forward is going to be the United States. Now, that doesn't necessarily point to a civil war; it just means some kind of war. But again, when we look at possibilities, we have to consider that. To that end, I think that if it starts, it's going to be a mixture of things. I mean, if we really had to look at it, I think it'll be a mixture of things if a civil war does ignite. Sure, these tensions are a part of it, but like anything else, it will be a straw that breaks the camel's back. And maybe the history books will look at, it was racial tension, it was all this. No, it's a lot of different types of tension that have been going on for quite some time. People are about to get smacked in the face with some very, very hard economic hardships. And of course, that I think is ultimately going to raise tensions above the boiling point.
Just to stay on the topic of war or civil war, I just wanted to talk a little bit about North Korea, because we see, all different things happening at the same time. And a lot of this revolves around the economy. And out in North Korea, we can see that, there's a huge amount of tension out there. They're firing missiles. One flew over Japan. United States and Japan and South Korea, they're continually having drills, and, both sides are provoking each other. Do you think there's going to be a war with North Korea? I mean, is this part of the entire plan to provoke a war with North Korea?
That's a great question. I don't know if it's the plan to provoke it, but I'll tell you, back in 99 and all the way through 2004, in fact, in my very first book, I wrote about the war with North Korea. Now, that was a long time ago. It's a part of where this is going. Now, the cycle and the model, I guess, really point out 4 different hot zones, 5 major players. And North Korea is definitely one of them. But because North Korea shares borders and has tensions and so on and so forth with its neighbors, and then, of course, its partners and supporters have problems and tensions with their neighbors, the Pacific is one of those major hot zones. North Korea, that situation is going to become unhinged. It almost has to. And we are seeing tensions rise there. You're right. We just saw, in fact, this broke last night in the middle of the night. The Telegraph threw it out there. Officers are ordering their troops to supplement their meager food rations by plundering local fields in order to keep up their strength for battle, according to the report in the Daily North Korea. Quote, the military officers are instructing their soldiers exhausted after training to eat corn in the fields because war is imminent. There is some economic struggle there. There is a lot of tension there. But we also have to look into the minds of the dictator himself, who is trying to separate himself from his father and model himself off of his grandfather. And that creates a whole bunch of tension. And it's almost prelude, really, when you think about it, because of who his grandfather was. Now, a lot of people, I think, ignore the fact that Kim Jong-un is actually Western educated. And that changes the dynamic of how we should look at him. But, that's kind of getting into some details. But, yeah. But again, I think the North Korea part is just one piece of a very large puzzle. I'm going to repeat something here that I have said on numerous interviews, written in numerous articles. I've written in my books for many years. China is not going to allow the United States presence on their border. Russia probably feels the same way. And both Russia and China share a border with North Korea. In fact, this morning, here's a little validation for that point. China said that they are not going to allow war or chaos on their border, which is an indirect way of saying if the United States comes over there and tries to do something, regardless of the situation, China is going to back North Korea. Now, China also said a couple weeks ago that if the United States attacks first, then China's got North Korea's back, but then they would try to remain neutral if North Korea attacked first, and so on and so forth. But that's only going to go so far, even if that is a truth. And a lot of people don't realize that China is making a power play. A power shift, a global power shift, is in process. The size and scope of China's military, for instance, changes almost daily, and it's growing substantially. And it doesn't take much to see that the I don't know, I guess you call it the war pot, is beginning to boil. In the Pacific specifically. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, a lot of these areas, Vietnam, for instance, there's a lot of tension there. North Korea is just a small piece. And you look at what's going on in the Baltics, the Middle East, and through the Horn of Africa, where China, by the way, just inaugurated their brand new base. A lot of people don't know that. Or the situation between China and India. The Pacific is a part of it. But it's a smaller piece of a much bigger play. But yes, I do think that situation is going to become unhinged, specifically because Kim Jong-un would like to. Well, and he's also losing a little bit of favor in his own country. A lot of people are starting to see that maybe this guy's not a living god.
Do you think this has to do more with China than North Korea? Yeah, so they can bring more military assets closer to the border of China? Well,
China's got this policy, and this is kind of why Taiwan is a problem. Not that it's a problem for the United States, but it's a problem for China because they would like to retrieve Taiwan. And it's a problem that the United States is involved with Taiwan. China wants to go ahead and just start acquiring what they consider to be their land, which would also include places like Japan and so on and so forth. Now, how long that takes before that all unfolds, I don't know. But North Korea, South Korea, Vietnam, the entire Asia area, basically, are all targets, even India. And that's kind of why what's going on between India and China is beginning to unfold right before our very eyes. There's tensions all over the place. And we have seen China as deep as Afghanistan. And I think that should be very telling. If you look at what's going on in Africa, if you look at what's going on in the Middle East, and you look at the tensions that are going around in the Pacific, you're seeing a very specific power play. You look at how they're turning out boats and munitions and aircraft carriers and so on and so forth. You look at the rhetoric coming out of Asia, out of China, and you see a much bigger and much scarier situation than just North Korea. Yes, North Korea is a wild card, and we're seeing the back and forth. In fact, this morning, I believe it was this morning, either this morning or last night, the United States started bombing along the North Korean border, saying, forget you can launch all this stuff, but we've got the bombers, we've got the fighters, And it just seems like we're on a hair trigger there. But again, we've got to look at the bigger picture. North Korea, if we go to war with North Korea, we're going to go to war with China. We are going to go to war with Russia, because neither Russia or China are going to allow the United States to be on their border. They've both already said that throughout the years. And I just refuse to believe that that's suddenly changed because North Korea is crazy.
Do you think that this is being pushed because of economic reasons to cover up the economy and bring it into a war economy, so you don't really know that the economy is collapsing?
That is very plausible. The economy, it's so funny to me. People, even the media, surprisingly, I'm kind of shocked by that, but even the media is talking about how great things are. GDP is up a little bit. Jobs are up, they say. And it's funny because nobody's taking the time to examine that. Jobs, 100,000 jobs are up, 200,000 jobs are up. But nobody contrasts that with the fact that we have over 300 million people in this country. 100,000 jobs, 200,000 jobs is a drop in the bucket. It's nothing, and so when I say that the economy is really not doing that well, you got to understand that nothing has really changed. The biggest warning sign should have been that we haven't changed our habits since the last financial warning. People call it a financial crisis. I call it a financial warning. And that was 2007, 2008. We're still buying things we can't afford, taking risks we shouldn't be taking. The stock market has had record high after record high, and I concede to that. But what too many people have forgotten is that what goes up must come down. Sure, jobs are getting better, but we're still lying to ourselves about unemployment using the U3 number. Unemployment rate for July 2017 was probably closer to 22%. A third of U.S. jobs could be at high risk of automation by the early 2030s, and that's just over a decade away. We have no solutions for that. And if you look at all the things that are near crisis levels, we begin to see that, wait a second, something's amiss here. U.S. households collectively have more than $1 trillion in credit card debt. And that's growing. That was a crisis level before it hit $1 trillion, and now we're over it. We have a pending pension crisis. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac just came out a few weeks ago and talking about how they needed a taxpayer bailout of as much as just under what was it? Well, it was a little over $99 billion if a severe economic downturn gripped the United States, quote unquote, which of course is probably going to happen sooner rather than later. We're already seeing the fractures of the economy in a lot of different ways. We still have a subprime auto loan crisis. I've written numerous times. In fact, I think we talked about it at one point, that not long ago, we were dealing with what we would consider to be normal auto loans, 3-4 years. But now all of a sudden, you've got payment schedules of 73, 84, and sometimes even 96 months. And these loan schedules are exploding. I mean, everybody's getting them. They're buying things they cannot afford. But it's not even just in the private sector. It's also in federal. Federal spending topped $400 billion for the first time in June. Debt and federal spending are skyrocketing. Now, you could bundle all that together and then add in the fact that Americans spend more on taxes than food, clothing, and associated things combined, and you have yourself a real problem. And I'm not the only one who's seeing it. I'll just read you a couple stories here in the last couple of days. Market Watch, the language and posture of the leading central bankers over the weekend at Jackson Hole shows that tensions over exchange rates are starting to heat up again. Quote, we're back in a little bit of that currency war dynamic. And that came from the president and founder of Macro Policy Perspectives. There was a story from Bloomberg Markets. Citigroup Inc. strategists, including Jeremy Hale, cite worrying developments that may signal the approach of a correction in stocks, while Commerzbank AG finds growing evidence of bearish sentiment in bond funds. It is across the board because we have not changed anything. Our habits, everything, we didn't learn from the problem, and it's just gotten worse. And the funny thing is people have been trying desperately to warn people of this for quite some time.
This does remind me of 2008. I mean, just the other day I talked about the housing bubble, and there are many cities out there like Seattle, Boston, Denver, where, we hit a certain level of the bubble, and now in those cities and many others, they're anywhere from 30 to 40% higher right now than it was during the last housing bubble. So we know what happened last time. Everything came crashing down. Now we're above that point of where we were, and it really doesn't look good. And especially with retail is just imploding on itself. And from your viewpoint, I mean, aren't these all just warning signs that something bad is about to happen?
They should be warning signs, but I'm going to share something with you, and this is going to take a second, so I apologize, but I think it's important for people to understand that history rhymes. They say history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Some people say history repeats. I think it's a little bit of both. But I'm going to use just American history to kind of convey the point. I've talked about the model or the cycle, I guess, a couple of times during this interview already. I know we've probably talked about it in the past, but I'm going to clarify a couple things here with you. I'm just going to use American history because I think it's important. So what we're looking at here is a 60-10-10 split. All right, 61 years. 10-year economic upheaval, 10-year war cycle. This goes on and on, over and over and over and over again. So basically, you can look at it as the setup, the 10-year tell, and the war and resolution. If you go back to, for instance, the Revolutionary time, if you look at like 1760 through say 1765, you got things like the Proclamation of 1763, which closed off the lands to North America. You have James Otis, his publication about taxation without representation. That same year, you had the Sugar and Currency Act, which was huge, right? Changed the way that the colonists were able to do business, and a lot of other people, actually. And then, of course, you had the Stamp Act, which was the first direct tax on American colonists. Of course, this didn't go well. Flash forward 10 years, you had the Intolerable Acts were put into place because, of course, it was a progression over time. Colonists had enough. They had their first Continental Congress, met in Philadelphia. They issued their Declaration and Resolves. Well, of course, as we know, the Revolution happened. That was 1775 to 1783. Treaty was ratified in 1784. We began to trade with China. Flash forward 60 to 61 years. You had 1884, 1885, right? 84 was it was known as the year that remade America. Now, this gets weird because well, I'll just walk you through it. James Polk became president. You had the gold rush, and you had basically the U.S. House overturned the gag rule on abolitionist papers. And then you had Texas join the Union. You had Manifest Destiny, actually, the Monroe Doctrine. Polk said that the Monroe Doctrine should be strictly enforced and that the United States should aggressively expand into the West. And that's kind of where that Manifest Destiny thing comes in. The 10-year tell is 54, 56. You had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You had the official founding of the Republican Party, and you had Bleeding Kansas. Okay, so that basically set off the war. Then, of course, you had the Revolutionary War, 1861 to 1865. Flash forward 60 to 61 years. 1925, Mussolini gained power. Mein Kampf was written. The Nazi Party gets their start. U.S. stocks, you talk about broker loans. They became popular. And, of course, now history knows that helped fuel the coming crash. You had the tech boom in 26, liquid fuel rockets, first radio fax, et cetera, et cetera. It was recognized as a bubble the following year. But what's crazy about that is the housing price downturn of 26 led to the rise in foreclosures. Foreclosures of residential properties and farms increased substantially in 26. Then, of course, you had the run on the Belgian banks and so on and so forth. The crash was underway. The 10-year tell was in 36 when Adolf Hitler decided that the time was right for Germany to reoccupy Rhineland. And then he ordered his economy and armed forces to be ready for war. And then, of course, you had Italy invading Ethiopia and so on and so forth. The war starts to happen 1939 to 1945. Of course, it was in 46 when Truman declared that hostilities would be over at December 31st, 1946. Tech boom, et cetera, et cetera. Now, flash forward roughly 60 to 61 years, you had 2006. which was the currency crisis that began, unquestionably. But also in 2007, you had a bunch of different stuff. The financial crisis ultimately came to fruition. Until 2008, you had artificial intelligence, iPhone, but North Korea's first nuclear test actually happened. And then, of course, if you look at it, this would be the 10-year tell. We've got the Great American Divide going on. North Korea states that they successfully tested their thermonuclear weapon. It's not even just a nuclear test, it's the weapon. You got the world's 62 richest people are now as wealthy as half of the world's population. Globalism and socialism are popular. You got domestic and global unrest, credit card, student loans, personal subprime loans. They're all at crisis levels. And then, of course, you've got the division between the left and the right. Some accuse Trump, so on and so on. It's just, I don't know. Tax revenues at record highs, still running a deficit. The whole thing, the economic indicators are out of control. It's nuts.
So from your model, this is the time period where things should go wrong.
Yeah, this is one of those things where I am very much paying attention, because we're not through the 10-year tell, but basically what happens if the model is correct, and again, we can do this well beyond American history. It just goes on and on and on. But there's a couple of other things that are going on too. Since we are witnessing a global power shift, we have to understand that there has yet to be in all of the history that we know of a global power shift that didn't come along with a massive war. So we talk about the economic problems, and the model is now, right? The model is saying that you should start looking and preparing now. And some have pointed to this fall, and again, the cycle suggests that all of this is very soon and that it's very much right on time. Now, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so you think that something could happen this fall from, your model, and what, it might not exactly happen right in the fall. It might maybe a winter, the spring, but around this time period. It's
close. And again, the model doesn't predict the future. It just tells us to kind of what to keep an eye out for in a certain time period, right? So we know that a big war, something big is going to change. We know that medicine is going to change. We know that, there'll be a massive tech boom in regard to war. The way war is fought will be a little bit different by the time it's all said and done. There's going to be a lot of different changes. This is a big one. It's not one of those small conflicts, which is mirrored every other conflict that we've ever seen. We just know that a lot of change is going to happen around this time. Now, the model does suggest that it's going to happen very soon, but when we start looking at the markets, we start looking at the trends, we start looking at all these things, we know that something very soon is about to happen. But again, I'm not the only one. This isn't just me. We see, it was last week, we were talking about in the media, basically, September market corrections showing up in stock charts. Ron Paul just said a few weeks ago that he wouldn't be shocked if stocks fell 25% and gold soared by as much as 50% by October. But people have been warning about this for a while. Just no one wanted to hear it. Heck, even back in March of this year, Robin Griffiths, he's the chief technical strategist at ECU Group, he said, quote, "We can go up quite a lot more. However, all of my work suggests the risks of a correction is in the second half of this year. And if I had to name the month, I'd say October." A week or so ago, Paul Krugman, professor of economics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, he said that the odds of a self-inflicted U.S. debt crisis now look pretty good, and that it looks fairly like that by October or so, there will come a day when the U.S. government stops paying some of its bills, including interest on debt. And according to my work, things are about to snowball. Now, I can't tell you it's going to be October. The model just says that it's soon. So either way, I think it's probably prudent to prepare just in case.
And for those people that, are hearing this for the first time, or maybe people that have been hearing it, for quite a while, when you say prepare, what do you mean?
Well, there are a lot of things you can do to prepare. All we have to do is look back to every single time this crisis happened. every time this cycle came about. Now, again, whether or not people want to believe that history repeats itself is irrelevant. All you have to do is look back at that cycle. What happened during the Great Depression and through the World War II or the Civil War, the Revolutionary War? We know that in times of crisis like this, supplies are limited. And that's just, due to the war effort or whatever the situation is, supplies and money are limited. Our economy is already crap. Things are, whether or not you want to look at it from a war perspective or an economic perspective, you're still talking about limited resources. And both are a threat, right? Both are on the radar, and it's become evident now. All you have to do is look at different reports from numerous different organizations that are showing similar things. And so if resources are going to be limited, it's probably a good idea to maybe stock up on some of those resources, whatever those resources are for you. People have been warning. Ron Paul's been saying it for a long time. I know you've had a lot of guests here on your program that have been talking about hedging their buying power with things like silver and gold. And if, by the way, if Ron Paul's talking about gold jumping up as much as 50%, I mean, that's massive. Silver's going to jump along with it, but that's massive, right? So look at that. If gold is going to jump by 50%, that means that the dollar is going to take a massive hit, which means that you're not going to be able to buy as much of anything really with the dollars that you have. So you want to hedge, you want a little bit of extra food, maybe anything really. I mean, anything you do will help your ultimate situation. And here's the beauty of this situation. If you prepare and by some miracle, all of this doesn't go, none of this happens, you haven't lost anything.
True.